Perhaps you are someone who believes that the architects of our global systems have everything under control. Perhaps you assume that a lifetime spent navigating the currents of international finance grants one the ability to foresee and immunize against any future crisis. You have likely never been awake in the dead of night, poring over sovereign debt yields and capital flow reports that form a mosaic. A picture telling you that the very framework of our world is about to be tested in ways that will challenge the character of nations and the resilience of every individual. If so, this discourse is for you. I wish to speak of the gravest decision I have ever faced. It is the choice between sharing intelligence that will fundamentally alter your perception of the coming months of 2025 or shielding you from a truth so profound it might incite panic, yet a truth that could preserve not just your life, but the very fabric of the society you hold dear. This is not about market forecasts or investment positions. This is about something far more foundational. I have been tracking patterns across the global chessboard, in finance, politics, and social structures, that all point to September 2025 as the inception point for a paradigm shift in our modern history. I am speaking today because most are utterly unprepared for what is to come, and I believe you have a right to the truth. Even a truth that is difficult to confront, one that will demand you make choices about your life, your assets, and your future that you never conceived you would have to make. My sleepless nights began 6 months ago. I started to discern faint signals in disparate data streams, sovereign wealth funds quietly repatriating assets, central banks making unusual moves in the gold market, back-channel diplomatic communications hinting at a coordinated response to a threat not yet public. Individually, these were mere anomalies. Together, they painted a picture of such profound concern that I first dismissed it as my own tendency to see feedback loops and points of inflection where none exist. But what truly kept me from sleep was not the specter of financial turmoil. It was the chilling realization that the principles I have worked to uphold for decades, the very concept of an open society, might prove fragile in the face of the systemic disruption these patterns foretell. For 3 months, I wrestled with this analysis, trying to convince myself I was misinterpreting coincidental trends. But last week, a piece of intelligence crossed my desk that erased all doubt, forcing me to confront the reality that to remain silent would be a betrayal of the very ideal of an informed citizenry. The burden of this knowledge has been immense. I find myself looking at my children and grandchildren, wondering how one prepares them for a world where the foundational assumptions of stability may no longer apply. I have had discussions with advisors and old colleagues, attempting to allude to my concerns without creating the very panic that could accelerate the crisis. And most difficult of all, I have had to accept that despite the resources and influence one may accumulate over a lifetime, some forces cannot be countered by any single individual. The best and perhaps only course of action is to provide people with the information they need to think and act for themselves. They need to protect themselves and their families. What I am about to disclose is not speculation. It is a conclusion drawn from a rigorous analysis of sovereign debt markets, private intelligence from financial institutions, and the behavioral patterns of global leaders. All indicators point to a single conclusion. September of 2025 will initiate a crisis of confidence that will test our core assumptions about economic stability, social cooperation, and individual resilience. The first indicator is the esoteric but alarming activity within sovereign finance. We are observing central banks and treasury departments engaging in large-scale currency swaps and debt rescheduling with an urgency that belies their public statements of stability. Actions that are normally planned over years are being executed in weeks. These are not preparations for a recession. These are maneuvers made by those who control the levers of the monetary system to insulate themselves from a coming systemic shock. The second indicator is the coordinated flight of private capital. I am not speaking of retail investors. I am referring to the quiet, almost invisible movement of assets by dynastic families in the upper echelons of the global elite. They are shifting wealth out of traditional financial instruments and jurisdictions, anticipating a period where capital controls and asset freezes become not just a possibility, but a political necessity. Their behavior suggests they expect a fundamental break in the rules of the game. The third indicator, and perhaps the one that signals the most immediate danger, is the breakdown in the norms of international cooperation. Back-channel diplomatic communications have grown cold. Long-standing agreements are being quietly abandoned. These are the subtle tremors that precede the earthquake, suggesting that nations are preparing to act in their own stark self-interest, abandoning the pretense of a rules-based global order. But the pattern that truly haunts me is the behavior of world leaders on a personal level. Their travel schedules, the security arrangements for their families, their public appearances, all have been altered in ways that suggest preparation for a period where normal governance may be untenable. They have access to intelligence that allows them to prepare for challenges before they are public knowledge. Their actions indicate they are bracing for a disruption that requires not just policy responses, but measures for personal security and continuity of leadership outside of official structures. The personal toll of carrying this knowledge has been devastating. Last Tuesday, I sat in my study at 2 a.m., staring at a draft of a memorandum to the board of my foundations, a message I wrote and deleted 17 times. How do you instruct people dedicated to building open societies to prepare for a world where those very societies might fracture? How do you warn them without destroying their morale and their ability to function in the present? I found myself weeping for the first time in years, not from fear, but from the immense weight of knowing that millions of families are proceeding with their lives built on an assumption of continuity, planning for school years, business quarters, and holidays that may never unfold as they imagine. The hardest moment came when my grandson asked me to help with his school project on the post-war economic order. As I looked at his innocent, curious face while he spoke of the IMF and the World Bank, I felt a deep structural break within me. How does one preserve a child's faith in the world's institutions while preparing him for a future where those institutions may fail? I have begun to have conversations with my family that I never imagined necessary. They are not apocalyptic warnings that would only breed terror, but quiet discussions on adaptability, on the strength found in community and intellectual capital, on the critical difference between material wealth and inner resilience. It was after one such conversation that my son asked me, "Father, why do you seem so sorrowful sometimes? And then when you think we're not watching?" my son asked me last week. The directness of his question forced me to realize my attempts to shield my family from this burden were failing. Children possess a unique intuition. They sense the dissonant frequencies beneath the surface of adult composure, even when the source of that dissonance is never spoken aloud. The stress has taken a physical toll. I sleep in fragments, I have lost my appetite, and I find it nearly impossible to concentrate on managing the foundations or analyzing market dynamics that now seem like relics of a bygone era. How can one focus on preserving capital when the very definition of capital is what is at stake? The intellectual isolation has been the most difficult aspect. I cannot discuss the full scope of my conclusions with my closest advisors without risking the very reflexive feedback loop I fear, where the expectation of panic becomes the catalyst for the collapse itself. Nor can I confide in old friends, for to do so would feel like an act of cruelty, robbing them of their peace during what may be the last few weeks of the world they have always known. Last Sunday, I found myself at my brother's home for what was meant to be a simple family dinner. As I watched him discuss his plans for a trip next spring, arguing playfully over itineraries and historical sites he wished to visit, I felt a physical pain in my chest. He spoke with such confidence in the continuity of the world, in the idea that borders would remain open and currencies stable, a certainty that I no longer possess about anything. I wanted to tell him to savor every moment of these quiet evenings, to treasure the simple luxury of debating a travel route instead of a survival strategy. But how do you tell a man who has already lived through the great upheavals of the 20th century that the peace he believed was his generation's lasting achievement is about to dissolve? How do you destroy the tranquility he has earned without breaking his spirit? Instead, I found myself committing the evening to memory, as if archiving the final artifacts of a fading epoch. The way the late afternoon light slanted across the dining room table, the sound of his laughter, the comfortable cadence of family conversation that rests on the unspoken assumption that tomorrow will be much like today. I stayed later than usual, performing small tasks that suddenly felt profound and essential. When he asked if I was all right, noting I was unusually quiet, I told him I was simply feeling grateful for these moments. The look he gave me suggested he understood my words held a deeper meaning, but he did not press. Sometimes those who have known you longest understand that presence is its own explanation. The drive home was one of the most difficult of my life. I thought of all the people of my generation across the world who are counting on September to be just another month in lives that have already seen enough turmoil. People who deserve to live out their years in peace, not to be forced to adapt to another fundamental rupture in the social contract. My own children have begun to notice the shift. They ask why I spend more time at home, why I insist on family dinners and weekend activities with a new urgency. They can sense that my priorities have been reordered, even if they cannot grasp the existential logic driving the change. 3 nights ago, my youngest asked if we were preparing to leave the country. I had been asking them unusual questions about what things are truly essential beyond material possessions and whether they could find a sense of home within themselves if our physical home were to change. I realized then that my attempts to prepare them psychologically were transparent enough to create anxiety, but too abstract to provide comfort. I realized that my attempts to prepare them psychologically had created a new form of anxiety, one born of ambiguity. The balancing act between providing foresight and preventing fear has become intellectually and emotionally exhausting. Every conversation is a delicate calibration. If I reveal too much, I risk seeding a panic that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I say too little, I leave those I care about exposed to a paradigm shift that could overwhelm them. Even my oldest relationships have been strained by the weight of what I cannot articulate. When friends ask about my outlook for the coming quarter, I find myself offering vague platitudes that feel intellectually dishonest, yet necessary to forestall discussions I am not prepared to have. The responsibility is, at times, crushing. People look to me for a frank assessment of the systems that govern our world, but they also trust me not to sound a false alarm. I have spent my life developing a thesis on reflexivity, the theory that market expectations can shape outcomes. Now I am paralyzed by it, caught between the duty to warn and the fear that the warning itself could trigger the collapse. I find myself observing the world through a painful, dual lens. I see the digital chatter of a society blissfully planning for a future that operates on yesterday's assumptions, debating fiscal policy as if sovereign debt were not a tinderbox, planning corporate expansions as if the global financial architecture were immutable. It feels as though I am watching passengers on a grand vessel debating their dinner seating while the ship's navigator has just received a telegraph warning of an unprecedented storm system directly in their path. The guilt of holding this knowledge, compounded by the terrifying possibility that my analysis could be wrong, has created an emotional burden I am unsure how to carry for much longer. Let me be clear. What these convergent patterns suggest is not merely a recession or a geopolitical conflict. They point to the beginning of a new type of systemic crisis in September, one that combines a crisis of confidence in fiat currency, the fragmentation of global cooperation, and the disintegration of the post-war social contract. This will require every person to fundamentally reconsider their relationship with work, with capital, and with the state. This is not a prediction of a specific event on a specific date. It is a recognition that multiple independent, high-level indicators are all pointing to the same narrow window of time in the same category of threat. To wait until these challenges become manifest to the general public is to wait until it is too late to prepare meaningfully. The emotional weight of this understanding has been almost unbearable. I wake each morning with the acute awareness that millions of people are making decisions, investing their life savings, choosing career paths for their children, planning for their retirement, based on a faith in a continuity that my analysis shows to be a fragile illusion. The hardest part is knowing that those who will be most grievously affected are the ones least equipped to withstand the shock. Families with modest savings whose wealth is held entirely in a single currency. Small business owners dependent on stable credit markets. People approaching retirement whose pensions are predicated on institutional promises that may not be kept. These are the people who occupy my thoughts when I debate whether to speak. They deserve the agency to make informed decisions about their futures. however frightening the information may be. But I am also acutely aware that a public warning could trigger the very bank run or market panic that would decimate their savings first. It is a delicate, terrible balance between providing a shield and accidentally wielding a sword. After months of internal debate, the time for deliberation has passed. We are at the precipice. I have therefore decided that the only ethical choice remaining is to share what I know, trusting in the rational capacity of free individuals to use this information to protect their communities, rather than to sow chaos or prey upon the unprepared. For those over 60, this warning is particularly urgent. The coming institutional failures will disproportionately affect those who depend on the stability of pensions, predictable incomes, and state-sponsored healthcare systems. The advice I would give my own contemporaries is this: ensure you have access to assets that exist outside the digital banking system, whose integrity may soon be compromised. The value you seek is not in fiat currency, but in tangible goods and diversified holdings. Strengthen the bonds with your family and local community. This social capital will prove more durable than financial capital in the days ahead. Most importantly, you must prepare psychologically. The coming uncertainty will demand a flexibility and patience that harkens back to earlier, more volatile eras. You must be ready to find stability not in the promises of institutions, but in the resilience of the human spirit. For the younger generations, the challenge will be different, though no less profound. You must prepare for a world where established career paths evaporate and economic security must be rebuilt on new terms. The most critical skills will not be those taught for the world that is passing away, but rather the intellectual tools for the one that is being born. The ability to think critically amid a storm of disinformation, to build communities based on mutual trust, and to maintain a determined hope when the structures you were told to rely upon no longer provide guidance. What is upon us is not the end of the world, but it is the end of the world as we have known it for nearly 80 years, the end of the post-war order. Those who will navigate this transition successfully will be those who have prepared not just practically, but philosophically, for a period that will fundamentally test our understanding of value, governance, and permanence. Let me be specific, for you deserve to understand the mechanics of what the data indicates is already in motion. Sharing these details now feels less like lighting a fuse and more like describing a fire that has already begun to smolder. The first wave will not hit our food systems. It will hit our financial systems, as the crisis is one of confidence. Within days, I anticipate a major sovereign debt market will freeze, or a too-big-to-fail institution will signal its insolvency. This will not manifest as empty shelves in a supermarket, but as empty order books on a stock exchange. It will be a digital bank run, a flight from currency to any tangible asset, triggering a global liquidity crisis. The psychological impact, the realization that digital wealth can evaporate in an instant, will be the primary accelerant. The second phase will be the cascading failure of the physical world as a consequence of this financial collapse. The intricate, just-in-time delivery networks that stock our stores and power our cities are entirely dependent on credit and stable currency. When financial systems freeze, the logistics of society grind to a halt. Power grids will fail not from attack, but because the utility companies that run them will be technically bankrupt. The breakdown of services will be the symptom of a deeper collapse in the social and economic trust that underpins our civilization. I am sharing this now not to create fear, but because the window for preparation is closing. Those who understand the nature of what is coming will be positioned not merely to endure it, but to lead, to help others, and to begin the vital work of building what comes next. This month will bring profound change, but it need not be a catastrophe. It is a challenge, but also an opportunity for those who are ready. It will reveal, with stark clarity, what is truly of value when everything else is stripped away. Share this understanding with those who still have a moment to prepare. Remember, knowledge of a coming storm is only useful if you use it to reinforce your shelter and help your neighbors do the same.